I never knew a life without fear. It lingered in the corners of my childhood home, seeped into the cracks of the wooden floorboards, and clung to the air like the bitter scent of stale cigarettes and cheap whiskey. Fear wasn't just an emotion, it was the foundation of my world, as real and unyielding as the walls that surrounded me. We lived in a modest, weathered house on the outskirts of Jackson, Mississippi. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors kept their blinds drawn and minds to themselves, where secrets were buried under the weight of silent understanding. My father, Henry, was a man shaped by anger and disappointment. His voice, sharp as shattered glass, echoed through the house long before his footsteps reached the door. I was 8 when I first realized the world outside my home was different. Other children laughed without glancing over their shoulders. Their parents hugged them tightly, whispered words of encouragement, and brushed away tears with gentle hands. In my house, tears were a sign of weakness, and weakness invited punishment. My mother, Linda, was a shadow of the woman she must have once been. Her eyes, dull and distant, often stared at nothing, as though she lived in a memory far kinder than reality. She moved through the house like a ghost, silent and unobtrusive, careful not to provoke the storm that was my father. I used to wonder if she dreamed of escape or if resignation had dulled her dreams into quiet acceptance. My sister, Maria, was my anchor. 3 years older, she carried herself with a defiant strength I admired but could never mimic. When the shouting began, she would pull me into the corner of our shared bedroom, wrapping her arms around me like a shield. "It'll pass," she'd whisper. "It always does." But some nights it didn't. Some nights, the storm raged until the sun rose, leaving bruises and broken things in its wake. One evening, after a particularly violent outburst, I found solace in an unlikely place, the small, sunlit library 3 blocks from our house. The librarian, Mrs. Reynolds, a woman with silver hair and warm eyes, never asked why I spent hours hidden between the shelves. Books became my refuge, their pages offering worlds where fear held no power. Church, too, provided a brief escape. Every Sunday morning, I'd slip away to the small chapel at the end of our street. Preacher spoke of love, redemption, and a God who saw every tear and still called us worthy. I wanted to believe him, to cling to the promise that suffering was temporary and love eternal. Yet, as I sat in the back pew, bruises hidden beneath my Sunday dress, doubt gnawed at my fragile hope. God saw everything. Why did he let it happen? Why did he remain silent? The answer never came, but the question haunted me, especially at night when the house fell into uneasy silence. I'd lie in bed, tracing the cracks in the ceiling, whispering prayers into the darkness. "God, are you there? Do you love me?" The stillness that followed felt colder than rejection. Life continued in that fragile, fractured rhythm until the day everything changed. It was summer, the air thick with humidity, the sun casting harsh shadows across the cracked pavement. My father's temper had been simmering all morning, each slammed cupboard and sharp word tightening the knot of dread in my stomach. I had learned the signs, the subtle shifts in his mood that signaled danger. By late afternoon, the storm broke. A spilled glass of water was the catalyst, an innocent accident met with disproportionate fury. His hand lashed out before I could react, and the world tilted. I don't remember falling. I don't remember hitting the ground. One moment I was there, small and trembling, and the next I was weightless, floating. The house faded beneath me, the oppressive walls dissolving into a golden light so pure, so encompassing that it took my breath away, if I had breath to lose. There was no fear, no pain, only peace, vast and endless, stretching beyond the confines of anything I had ever known. I didn't understand it then. How could I? A child raised in shadows doesn't easily grasp the brilliance of light. But in that moment, as I hovered between what was and what could be, I knew one thing with unwavering certainty: I was not alone. Before we continue, I have something special for you. We love connecting with our community here, and we want to make our next video even more meaningful. If you'd like to hear your name and your city mentioned in our next story, leave a comment below with your name, your city, and don't forget to like the video. Imagine the joy of hearing your name shared with thousands of others, a moment just for you, a reminder that your story matters, just like Edith's. Join our community and let's make this journey together. Asterisk.
The days that followed were a blur of confusion and silence. I had returned to my body, but something inside me had shifted. The weight of fear that had always pressed down on my chest felt lighter, not gone, but bearable, like a distant echo instead of a constant roar. My father barely acknowledged what had happened. Maybe he didn't understand it himself. He had left me crumpled on the floor, muttering something I couldn't hear. And when I woke hours later, the house was dark, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I pulled myself up, aching and disoriented, and stumbled into bed without a word. Maria noticed the change first. She always did. The next morning, while brushing her hair in front of the cracked bathroom mirror, she glanced at me through the reflection. "You're quiet," she said, her tone cautious, different. I shrugged, unsure how to explain something I didn't fully understand. How could I put into words the feeling of being held by light, of hearing silence that spoke more clearly than any voice ever had? How could I describe the peace that lingered even as bruises bloomed beneath my skin? Instead, I said I'm fine, just tired. But I wasn't just tired. I was awake in a way I had never been before. Colors seemed brighter, sound sharper. The air itself felt alive, vibrating with an energy I couldn't quite place. And beneath it all was the certainty that I had touched something real, something greater than the brokenness of my home. At church that Sunday, I sat in the same back pew I always did, but the words of the sermon hit differently. The preacher spoke of grace, of redemption, of a love that never abandons us, no matter how deep the darkness. I had heard it all before, but now it felt personal, like a secret whispered just for me. After the service, I lingered outside, watching families laugh and talk as they headed home. For the first time, I didn't envy them. I didn't wish for their lives or their smiles. I had something they couldn't see, something that no amount of Sunday dresses or family dinners could replace. I had hope. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoot breaking through cracked soil, but it was enough. Enough to make me believe that life could be more than survival, that maybe, just maybe, love could find its way into even the darkest corners. I didn't know then how much that hope would be tested. I didn't know that the light I had glimpsed was only the beginning, a promise of something far greater yet to come. But as I walked home that day, the sun warm on my face and the memory of peace still fresh in my mind, I held onto it with everything I had. Life didn't change overnight. My father's anger didn't dissolve, and my mother didn't suddenly find her voice. The house remained steeped in the same quiet tension it always had, but I was different. I carried something within me now, like a flickering candle shielding itself against the wind. Maria kept watching me, her gaze sharp with suspicion. She wasn't one to believe in miracles. Life had taught her that hope was dangerous, a baited trap that snapped shut when you reached for it. You can't pretend everything's fine just because you've decided to believe in fairy tales, she muttered one evening, folding laundry on the worn couch. It's not pretending, I replied quietly. It's knowing there's more than this. She didn't answer, just shook her head and walked away, frustration trailing behind her like smoke. I didn't blame her. If I hadn't seen it, felt it, lived it, I wouldn't have believed me either. The strange thing was the world outside seemed to respond to this inner shift. The librarian, Mrs. Reynolds, smiled more warmly when I entered the library, slipping me books she thought might speak to my restless mind. The boy who sat 2 rows behind me in school, James, noticed when I winced from an old bruise and quietly passed me a note. "You okay?" It was the first time someone outside my family had acknowledged the truth without me saying a word. But the biggest change happened one quiet afternoon when the house was empty except for me and my father. He was in the backyard, tending to the garden. He kept like a man clinging to the last piece of control in a chaotic world. I watched from the kitchen window, half expecting the usual outburst when something didn't go his way. But he moved slowly, methodically, the lines on his face deeper than I'd ever noticed. Without thinking, I stepped outside. The sun was warm, the grass cool beneath my bare feet. He glanced up, surprised to see me standing there, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, fragile and uncertain. "Do you need help?" I asked finally, my voice steadier than I felt. He frowned, the lines around his mouth tightening. "Since when do you care about the garden?" I didn't have an answer that would make sense to him. How could I explain that I was trying to bridge a gap that had seemed unbridgeable my whole life? That I was reaching across the chasm, not because I forgave everything, but because I couldn't carry the weight of hatred anymore? "Just thought you might like company," I said, shrugging. For the first time I could remember, he didn't push me away. He nodded toward the small patch of roses near the fence. "Weed that bed if you want to help." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't love. But it was a crack in the armor he wore so tightly, and I took it for what it was, a start. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something that sent a shiver down my spine. The light I had seen, the peace I had felt, it hadn't just been for me. It was meant to ripple outward, like rings spreading from a stone thrown into water. I was the stone and my life was the pond. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind was too full, heart too restless. Change had begun, slow and subtle, like the first hint of dawn. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the veil between this world and whatever lay beyond it had thinned. The real journey was only just beginning. The days blurred together, each one folding into the next like pages in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. I moved through school, home, and church with a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching my life from outside myself. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. Maria had stopped asking questions. I think she could sense that whatever had happened to me was beyond her understanding. And for someone who thrived on logic and control, that was too much to confront. So she pulled away, immersing herself in school and part-time work, leaving me to navigate this new reality alone. The only place I felt truly grounded was the library. Mrs. Reynolds had an uncanny ability to hand me the right book at the right time, as if she knew what my heart needed before I did. One afternoon, she slid a worn copy of The Great Divorce across the counter, her eyes kind but serious. "This one might speak to you," she said quietly. I read it in one sitting, tucked into the far corner of the library, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. The book spoke of souls caught between heaven and hell, not by force but by choice, by the inability to let go of pain, resentment, and pride. I closed the book with trembling hands, realizing how tightly I had clung to my own bitterness, how it had shaped my life as surely as my father's fists. That night, I dreamed of the light again. It wasn't the blinding brilliance I had seen before, but a softer glow, like the last light of day stretching across the horizon. In the dream, I stood at the edge of a vast field, the grass golden and swaying gently in an unseen breeze. On the other side of the field, shadowy figures moved slowly, their outlines blurred and indistinct. I stepped forward, drawn by an invisible pull, but before I could cross the field, a voice stopped me. It wasn't spoken aloud, but filled my mind completely, calm and unwavering. "You must choose, light or shadow, love or fear, life or existence." I woke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of those words lingering like the last notes of a song. The house was silent, the darkness pressing in around me, but I didn't feel alone. The choice had been laid before me, and deep down, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I found my father in the garden. He was kneeling beside the rose bushes, pruning dead branches with practiced hands. I stood there for a long moment, watching him, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. "Dad," I said finally, my voice steady but soft. "Can we talk?" He didn't look up right away, just kept working, the rhythmic snip of the shears filling the air. When he did glance at me, his expression was guarded, as if bracing for a fight. "What is it?" he asked, voice gruff but not unkind. I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. I don't want to hate you anymore. His hand froze mid-cut, the shears trembling slightly. For a long moment, he said nothing, eyes fixed on the rose in front of him. Then, slowly, he set the shears down and sat back on his heels, exhaling heavily. I don't expect you to forgive me, he muttered, voice rough with something that sounded almost like regret. I wouldn't forgive me if I were you. It's not about deserving, I replied quietly. It's about choosing. I can't carry this anymore. It's killing me, and I think it's killing you too. The silence between us stretched, heavy with years of unspoken hurt and unmet expectations. But in that silence, something shifted, a crack in the wall we had both built, small but undeniable. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and picked up the shears again. The roses need water, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I didn't press him for more. I simply turned, walked to the spigot, and filled the old green watering can. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a start, and for the first time, that felt like enough. Days turned into weeks, and the fragile truce between my father and me held, though it felt more like an unspoken agreement than true peace. We moved around each other, like strangers learning new roles, careful not to stir the embers of old battles. I wasn't naive enough to believe everything had changed, but the weight that had once suffocated me now felt manageable. Maria, ever the skeptic, watched it all with wary eyes. You really think people change that easily? She asked one night while we washed dishes side by side. The warm water ran over our hands, the rhythmic clink of plates filling the silence between us. No, I admitted, but I think they can try, and sometimes trying is enough. She didn't argue, just sighed and handed me the last plate to dry. In her silence, I heard the unspoken fear that hope was just another trap, another promise waiting to be broken. It was around that time the dreams began again. Not the light this time, but something quieter, more intimate. I'd find myself walking down familiar streets, bathed in twilight, the houses softened by the fading sun. I'd hear whispers, not words, but impressions, urging me to look closer, to notice the cracks in the facades and the fragile beauty hiding within them. One night, I dreamed of my mother. She stood in the kitchen, the same coffee cup she always held cradled in her hands. But she looked different, whole, present in a way I'd never seen her before. When she spoke, her voice was steady, free from the usual weariness. You can't save him, she said, her gaze steady on mine. But you can love him. And sometimes, love is the only bridge strong enough to cross the distance between two broken hearts. I woke with tears on my cheeks, the echo of her words lingering long after the dream had faded. Love. It sounded so simple, yet it had always been the hardest thing to give, especially to someone who had been the source of so much pain. The next morning, I found myself back in the garden, kneeling beside my father as he tended to the rose bushes. He didn't speak, but he didn't send me away either. We worked side by side, the silence between us no longer heavy with resentment, but something closer to understanding. As I trimmed away a cluster of dead leaves, I realized how much of life was like this, pruning away the damage, making room for new growth. It wasn't about forgetting the past, but choosing not to let it define the future. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, I sat on the porch steps and whispered another prayer into the cooling air. Not for escape this time, but for strength. Strength to keep choosing love, even when it hurt. Strength to believe that grace could mend what anger had broken. In the distance, my father's silhouette moved among the roses, his posture less rigid, his movements less hurried. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt something close to peace. The first cool breeze of autumn swept through the garden as leaves turned amber and gold, fluttering to the ground like memories shed from an old life. My father and I continued our silent truce, tending the roses together without words, as though the earth itself understood what language could not express. One evening, as I gathered fallen petals into a small basket, he spoke. "You really believe in all that? Grace, forgiveness, second chances." I looked up, startled by his question. He rarely talked about anything deeper than weather or chores, but there was something raw in his eyes, something that made me set the basket down and sit beside him on the worn wooden bench near the fence. I admitted. Not until I saw the light. Not until I realized how much hate was hollowing me out. It wasn't about deserving forgiveness. It was about surviving, about choosing peace over pain. He nodded slowly, staring at the dirt beneath his boots. "I don't know if I can change." "Maybe it's not about changing overnight," I said softly. "Maybe it's about small choices. Every day, choosing love over anger, kindness over cruelty, showing up even when it's hard." For the first time, he didn't argue. He just sat there, shoulders slumped, the weight of years pressing down. And in that moment, I saw not a monster, but a broken man, one shaped by his own wounds, fighting demons I would never fully understand. Days passed, and those small choices began to stack, like bricks forming the foundation of something new. He yelled less. He worked more quietly. And once, after dinner, he muttered, "Thank you," without looking up. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The garden became our sanctuary. We pruned, planted, and watered, side by side, rebuilding something that had long been left to wither. And with each bloom that opened, I felt hope take root, fragile but real. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, I realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about refusing to let the past define the future. It was about freedom, not just for the one being forgiven, but for the one choosing to forgive. My father looked at me then, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for," he said quietly. "Stronger than me." I smiled, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. No, just tired of living in the dark. And for the first time, it felt like we both were stepping into the light, together. If you've made it this far, it means the story touched you in some way, and that's why we share it, not for views, not for profit, but because we believe in the power of connection and healing. We don't make any money from this. It's a labor of love. If you'd like to support us, the best way is simple. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our community. It's free for you, but means the world to us. Let's keep spreading hope, one story at a time. The garden, once a battlefield of silence and resentment, had transformed into something sacred. The last of the autumn roses bloomed despite the cooling air, petals soft and vibrant against the fading green. My father and I worked side by side, not always speaking, but understanding more than words could convey. One afternoon, as we cleared fallen leaves from the path, he paused, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Funny," he muttered, almost to himself. "Never thought I'd find peace in a place like this." I looked at him, the lines of his face softened by the golden light filtering through the branches. "Peace doesn't always come where we expect it," I replied. "Sometimes it finds us when we're finally ready to stop running." He nodded, the corners of his mouth tugging into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to show that healing, while slow and imperfect, was possible. That night, I sat on the porch steps, the sky stretched wide and endless above me. The stars blinked like distant beacons, each one a reminder that darkness, no matter how vast, could never fully extinguish the light. I whispered a prayer into the night air, not for escape, not for change, but for the strength to keep choosing love, day after day. The house behind me, once filled with tension and unspoken pain, now held something different. Not perfection, but possibility. And that, I realized, was all I had ever truly wanted. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. There's another video waiting for you. One that could be just as revealing, just as life-changing. Click the video on the screen and continue this journey with us. Let it be the next step in your path to peace and understanding. And before you go, do us a small favor that means the world to us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our community. We don't make money from this. We do it because we believe in the power of stories to heal and inspire. Your support keeps us going. Leave a comment with Amen if this story spoke to you, and let the blessings continue to flow in your life. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next video.